yet what they really should be doing is going to a therapist, you know. And I'm not being glib about this, because I really do think, you know, one thing that we do in our lives is that we tend to divide our everyday life from the spiritual, and I think that's totally wrong, because I think the two are interconnected, and that probably for a lot of people it's far more spiritual to be going to a therapist than to be saying their mantra. That's the best thing, the most spiritual thing they can be doing. And so when I talk about these things, you know, even though I don't make that distinction, because I think that, you know, first of all, I don't believe that any of us should be aiming toward acquiring the ability to stick our hand in a candle flame just for the sake of doing that. But the reason that I talk about it and the reason that I focus on some of these things is, as I say, because developing those skills of being able to do that are going to help you wherever you're at. It's not that the goal is to stick your hand in a candle flame. The goal is to just, you know, be alive, healthy, and happy. And as I say, I don't divide the biological and everyday world from the spiritual world, because I've long believed that the body is really just the most solid portion of the soul, that there isn't this division that a lot of religions teach. Before I move on, I just want to mention one other thing about this in this area of healing. Like, we looked at several different categories of healing, or let's say body manipulation. One involved people who were able to access some extraordinary level of reality through religious faith. There's another. Let me tell you a couple of quick stories about some healings for the purpose of looking at the mechanisms behind them. There's a story in the book that I talk about where a fellow had lymphatic cancer, had tumors the size of oranges all throughout his body. His doctor felt he had only several days left to live, and he heard about a new chemotherapy, and he said, "Doctor, you got to put me on this chemotherapy." And the doctor said, "Well, it takes weeks to take effect. It's not going to help you." And he said, please, just put me on it. So the doctor put him on it. And 3 days later, the man's tumors had melted, as the doctor put it, like snowballs in a hot stove. The guy's up. He resumes his life. He's fine. A couple of months later, reports on this drug come in saying it's not as effective as everyone thought. Bam, 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 the guy's tumors come back. He's back in the hospital. And the doctor starts to realize it wasn't this drug that did this. And so he says to the guy, he lies to the guy. He says, "Well, listen, those reports are wrong, and not only are they wrong, but I have an even more potent version of this new drug. I'm going to give you this more potent version." And he injects the guy with just salt water. Well, the guy, because he believes in it, his tumors melt away again like snowballs in a hot stove, faster, as the doctor put it, than even the strongest radiation treatment could have melted them away. A couple of months later, the guy reads final reports on the drug, says it's absolutely ineffective. His tumors come back and he dies. But the bottom line is that, you know, he had this latent ability to heal himself. But he's been taught from day one that he can't do that, you know. He can't heal himself. So to access that belief system in him, and I call it the infinite self, because I say, you know, the only self in us that has limits is the conscious self. Beneath the conscious self, there's an infinite self that has no limits, that can do anything. But because we're so indoctrinated to believe that we have limits, most of the ways that these extraordinary events are accessed are through sort of accidents in general. I mean, or through sort of serendipity, like, as I say, religious faith. In this particular instance, this was not religious faith. It was faith in technology or science, faith that this drug would heal him, but not faith that he had the healing capacity himself. Another thing that often accesses these sorts of things are cases, of course. One case I talk about in the book where this young boy has... I forget the technical name for the disease, but colloquially it's referred to as alligator skin. It's a genetic condition where your skin gets very hard and rough and scaly. People in freak shows were labeled as, you know, the alligator boy, the alligator woman, whatever, who had this condition. As I say, it's a genetic condition. Well, this guy, a doctor who did hypnosis, a therapist, decided to try an experiment, and he hypnotized the kid, and he said his skin was returning normal. He did this over a period of sessions. And lo and behold, the kid's skin returned to normal. Now, they discovered that he had to have follow-up sessions for the rest of his life, telling his unconscious mind, or as I would put it, the infinite self, that his skin was normal. But here's another instance where, you know, we're taught, we have this very pervasive belief system that if you're genetically predisposed to something, if it's a genetic condition, that's it, it's absolute. You don't overcome it, it's your destiny, it's your blueprint, live with it. This kid, you know, he believed it consciously, so he couldn't access it, but this doctor, by using hypnosis, was able to access this deeper level of functioning where he was able to just switch it and override his own genetic programming. So I bring this up because I want to give you a variety of examples of how, you know, if you examine the literature, how people have accessed this. Now, so that, what is the link with all these things? And the link is, you know, that to access these extraordinary abilities, we have to bypass the limitations of our belief systems and to get into these things. Now, part of the problem, and is that we all have been taught to believe that here we are extraordinary, human beings are extraordinary because we have conscious minds. And I don't really mean to poo-poo the idea that the consciousness is extraordinary, but it doesn't take into account a whole lot of other things in us that are equally extraordinary that we tend to dismiss. Basically, I think the consciousness or self-aware part of us is really vastly overrated, because when you start to really examine these phenomena and other phenomena having to do with the human psyche, you discover that we're really iceberg beings. Most of us is beneath the surface. Just a little bit of us. I call it the oil slick on the surface of the psyche, is the self-aware part. And most of us is beneath the surface, but we tend to think that most of us is conscious and there's just a little bit beneath the surface. And really just the opposite is true. So in doing this, you've got to kind of, always keep this in mind. Don't think, well, I can't do that, because you've got this, most of you can do it. Just a little part of you can't do it. Let me give you an example of just some, as I say, I believe that this unconscious part is the infinite self. It can do anything. But how is it that we seal ourselves off from this infinite potential? What processes go on that close these doors to us? I have an example. When I was a child, I grew up, as I mentioned, had a lot of paranormal phenomena happen, and one thing that I could do is I could sort of perform a shift inside my head that would enable me to see other realities. When I would look at the sky, I could shift and I could see these other beautiful landscapes and as a child, of course, you don't have the intellectual savvy you do as an adult, so I didn't know that it was abnormal what I was doing, and I didn't know what it was. And one day I said to my mother, "Is that heaven? When I do that, am I looking at heaven?" She said, "Yeah, you're looking at, that's heaven." She thought I was being poetic. And so I thought, okay, great, that's heaven, I get it. This makes sense to me now. And one day when I was 5, I was staring at the sky, and I'd done this shift, and I was looking at this beautiful landscape of these mountains, and the technicolor, just beautiful colors, this celestial vista that I was staring at, and it had 2 moons, and just, always, as I say, just extraordinary beauty. And I obviously had such a rapt expression on my face that it sort of my mother and my grandmother came up to me, and they said, "What on earth are you looking at?" And I said, "Well, I'm looking at heaven." And they said, "You mean you're looking at the heavens?" And I said, "No, I'm looking at heaven, the 2 moons, the mountains, da-da-da-da." And they said, "There's nothing like that there, that's just sky." And I thought, well, that's awfully puzzling that they don't see that. But what I didn't realize, and what happened, is that was the last time I saw heaven. So clearly, we have this tremendous drive to lock into the consensus, and that's one thing that shuts us off from the infinite self. There have been, experiments. There was an experiment performed by a psychologist named Solomon Ox, where he would take a room full of people, and he would draw a line on the blackboard 5 inches long and a line, say, 10 inches long. And he'd have send one person out on some sort of spurious errand, like, go get something. And he'd tell everyone in the room, he'd say, when they come back, I'm going to ask you if these lines are different in length or the same in length. And then, but I want you all to say they're the same, even though they're drastically different. So poor person that's the dupe in the experiment would come back and he'd go, "Okay, I've drawn 2 lines on the board. Are they the same or are they different?" And everyone who thinks they're the same length, raise their hand. Everyone would raise their hand. And of course, the hand would shoot up to the person that was out of the room, because they didn't want to be the only person who saw a different reality from everyone else. And I think we even do this at a deeply unconscious level, because we're so programmed to think, that there's a strategy and consensus, that we have to agree with the consensus. And I'm sure it had survival value when we were hunter-gatherers, but it doesn't have survival value when you're in the hospital with cancer, and everyone's telling you you're going to die. Then you can't buy into the consensus, because then you're closing yourself off to as I say, the infinite self. And there are all kinds of examples of people doing this, that we still have these abilities within us, but we've closed ourselves off to it. There's an interesting story, I don't know if any of you have read a book called The Inner Game of Tennis by a guy named Tim Galway. And what he does is he would teach people to improve their tennis stroke, and he would take them and he'd say, well, they'd say, well, I'd really like to improve my game, and he has this trick. He'd say, well, show me how you'd like to hit the ball. And they'd go, well, I'd really like to be able to hit it like this, and they'd hit it like that. And they'd go, show me that again, and they'd go, well, I'd really like to be able to hit it like this. He'd have them do it 3 or 4 times, and then he would say, well, it's too bad you can't hit it like that. And then it would hit them that they were able to hit it the way they'd always wanted to, but they'd always felt they couldn't until he sort of tricked them into doing it. And so sometimes we have to sort of trick ourselves into it, and sometimes people, just by dint of ignorance, are lucky enough